Man, sorry about that. How you doing? How's everyone doing today? Let's get this. Let's get this started. Let's get this started. How's everybody doing today? My name is Michael Motley. I am the host of One Mic Black History Podcast. Um, I was trying to wanted to start doing this, going live, so I could reach out to you guys and so you can get to know me. I typically my channel is pretty faceless, so on any given day, nobody gets to see me. They don't get to talk to me, and I wanted to do something as a way to try to reach out to people. This started out. I was going to try to start doing questions, try to start doing questions, reach out to people and say, hey, and ask me Black history questions. And we kind of just see where that goes and where that takes us. That did not go very far because I don't get very many questions. Because I don't get very many questions. But so what I've started doing is kind of revamped it a little bit, where I just go through what happened in Black history over the past week, and then we see what that gets us. I'll start out with this week in Black history and kind of talk about those events, and then afterwards we'll shoot the shit. I'll answer any of your questions, and we'll try to keep this going for around an hour or so. Um, Anyway, without further ado, I'm not going to take too much of your time. We're gonna get it cracking and start the party. Start the party. So one of the few questions that I did get is from my guy, Mr. Grimm. He is another Black history creator. He is um, much larger than I. So he asked, what books have inspired you the most and what historical figures inspire you the most? And so this is a great question, because one of the books that I always look back to is The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois. And one of the reasons why this is so important is Du Bois was one of the first, Black scholars who talked about the Black experience through a kind of a Black intellectual lens. And he offered an opportunity to kind of view race and racism through sociology, through a Black intellectual lens, something that had not been done up until that point. The book is a collection of essays that he had put together, and he had kind of formed into one book. But one of the key concepts from it is the idea of the double consciousness. The double consciousness is this conflict that how Black people feel versus how they are perceived in a white dominated society. The quote that he uses is that it is a particular sensation, this double consciousness is always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. And this idea still today of how we see ourselves, how Black people see ourselves, and how we are perceived in a white dominated society shapes how we do almost everything. There's this idea of not wanting to do things in front of company or not say things in front of company because we don't want things to be perceived a certain way, because they don't see us the way that we see ourselves. This concept dominates media, education, politics, and even how we create content. Even how we create content. So it always, like, this idea of the double consciousness is one of the things is for me that is super important about this book, and it's one of the reasons why I love it. But also, and most importantly, Du Bois was super spicy and kind of and very petty. So he saved the spiciest bit of his book for last. He has a passage in there about Booker T. Washington's leadership. During that time, Booker T. Washington was considered the public face of Black people as a whole. He had kind of been placed into that mantle after Frederick Douglass's death. And this book challenged that assertion. And Booker T. Washington was a bit of a machine. They used to call it the Tuskegee machine, because he had a bit of power behind him. And while he would not address anything personally, you would feel the heat from his supporters. You would feel the heat from his supporters. So Washington's approach was basically that he preached racial upliftment through vocational training and economic self-reliance. And I'm not gonna lie to you that that's not in itself a bad idea, but this avocation, this he advocated for accommodation through accommodation to segregation and temporarily suspending the demand for civil rights. In his famous 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, he urged Black Americans to cast down their bucket where they are and focus on becoming skilled workers and farmers rather than pushing for political power or desegregation. And Du Bois was like, nah. Like, nah, that's not gonna work. That's not gonna work for me. And he in the book, he said that he respected Washington's achievement, but believed that his approach was too narrow, submissive, and short-sighted. He'd argued that Black people needed higher education and not just vocational training to produce leaders and thinkers who could challenge white supremacy. Political rights was a non-negotiable issue, and there was no true path to progress without the ability to vote or to access to good schools or legal protection. Washington's silence on racism only reinforced white supremacy by validating segregation and second-class citizenship. In the book, he would write that Mr. Washington represents in Negro the old attitude of adjustment and submission. It is through nature must needs make men narrow in order to give them force. Basically what he's saying is that while Washington was sincere and influential, that he thought that his views were old and antiquated. And to add further context to this, they grew up in completely different time periods. Washington grew up enslaved and spent, I think, up until his sixth enslaved. So his viewpoint on race and race relations was much different from Du Bois, who grew up, I want to say, in Connecticut they weren't rich by any standards, but they were decidedly middle class. His views on race and race relations were completely different. But this push, this hatred, this beef that he had with Washington would change civil rights in ways that people would never expect, or at least I wouldn't expect, because what he did in his generational hatred, he created an entire group called the Niagara Movement, who only objective was to hate on the policies that Booker T. Washington had. He put together a group of people who all was not feeling his accommodation style, and that was their whole thing, is that we're going to push back on his views on Black people. Now, while they didn't do much, they didn't accomplish much, what did happen is around 1908, 1909, the group was dissolved and formed the NAACP. After a race riot, they felt that they needed a more interracial organization to combat Black civil rights and support Black civil rights. And they thought that having a more interracial organization would help them. So a lot of the members from the Niagara Movement were folded up into the NAACP, with W.B. Du Bois becoming their part of leadership and their executive, the editor of The Crisis. At that time, just a slight little tidbit. At that time, I know that the NAACP, that C stands for color, but most of the leadership was white. Vast majority. Du Bois was the only Black member of the leadership of the NAACP at that time, and it would gradually, over the years. By 1930, it was mostly Black, because they found out that having an interracial organization didn't really work for them, and the only people who would advocate for Black people would be Black people themselves. But that took time. In the early years, the NAACP was mostly a white organization. Anyway, I enjoy that Du Bois is such a hater that he changed civil rights. But the kind of person that he was, that depending on when you look at his life, he would change. He would change. In his early life, he thought that being an intellectual could solve the world's race issues. And later on, he thought he could solve it through protests and civil rights. And by the end of his life, he felt that you couldn't change America, and that communism was the best way. And he ended up leaving the country. They took his passport away, and then we got it back. He left the country, which kind of feel that way these days. So one of the people, though, to answer the second part of that question, which people are the most influential or that really influenced me is Ida B. Wells. One of the great things about Ida B. Wells is that the turn of the century, she was a fierce advocate and journalist, and one of the loudest voices against lynching in America. In 1890, while much of America was ignoring or justifying lynching, she would start to investigate lynching and using dates and names, and would challenge the myth that lynching was used as a punishment for black men's crimes. And she exposed the real truth that lynching was used as a tool of racial terror and to suppress the success and independence of black people. She would publish the Southern Horrors and the Red Records, one of the earliest examples of data-driven reporting on racial violence, long before modern journalistic standards. When she worked in Memphis, she had her own paper. I want to say it was called the Memphis Free Press. In one of the articles, after her friends who owned she has some friends that owned a grocery store. They were competing against a white gentleman who didn't like the success of their grocery store. He ended up an incident occurred at the grocery store, which led to all of the black men who owned that store being lynched. To this point, Ida wrote an article about lynching in the Memphis Free Press and then left and went to New York. In this particular article, there is a passage that says that nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern men are not careful, a conclusion might be reached which would be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. Basically saying, y'all full of shit. This is the whole thing's built on a lie, and that really your women might be kind of attracted to black men. This got her paper burned to the ground in Memphis. She could never come back. They told her if she came back, she would get lynched. She would have almost 100% gotten lynched. And she never did. She never did come back, which was probably a good idea. But this is the sort of person she was. She wrote what was going on, what was happening, and the truth. And the truth, and that stuff is powerful, and it still is powerful, especially these days. We need people who write about the truth and what's really going on. So anyway, moving along. So to answer Mr. Grimm's question, the two people that are most influential to me were the book was The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, because she was a trooper. She was a real trooper, and she doesn't get the credit that she was due. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about like what happened in Black history over the past week. The big thing that happened was the anniversary of the assassination of Medgar Evers. He was assassinated on June 12, 1963. Medgar Evers was the first field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi. But the interesting thing about his life is that it was rather short. He was only 37 years old when he was murdered, but he became a bit of a martyr, a rallying cry for the movement after his death. They spent a lot of time, marching in his honor. And later on, when a lot of groups, the younger groups, felt that they watched too many people die, Medgar Evers was one of the people that they looked to. Like, I've watched a lot of my friends and associates die from the movement, from being nonviolent when they're not being nonviolent to us. Anyway, back to the point. Medgar Evers was a World War II veteran. He went to Alcorn. At Alcorn, he was not only a great student, but he was involved in a lot of things politically. I think he ran for president. He was part of the debate club. After graduating, he went into work in insurance, but that was not his calling. He wanted to help his community and started doing working in civil rights. I can't remember the name of the organization. Let me see if I can bring this up. See if I can find it. Anyway, he started working. He started working more in civil rights. At one point, he got a job as a field secretary for the NAACP and moved his family to Jackson, Mississippi. This is where he worked on everything from desegregating parks and pools to voter registration to investigating the death of Emmett Till. During that time, he was making quite a bit of waves. So on June 12th, 1963, up until that point, he was usually getting escorted home either by the FBI or the local PD. That particular day, he did not have an escort. He got out of his car carrying some clothes that said Jim Crow must go, some shirts that said Jim Crow must go, and he was shot in the back. Stumbled 30 feet where he didn't die. He wasn't dead yet. Where he was found by his wife. They would take him to the hospital. Hospital initially was like, you can't come here. We don't allow black people here, until they realized who he was, and then they treated him. But in less than an hour, he was gone. He was shot by a man by the name of Byron Della Beckwith. The reason why we know this is because they found a rifle with his fingerprints on it. And he was telling people, he could not stop telling people about his plans and his hate for integration. And Medgar Evers was a prime target. He was eventually arrested and tried for the murder of Medgar Evers. During his first trial, the governor of Mississippi, the name was Ross Barnett, showed up to the trial to shake hands with Byron Della Beckwith in full view of the jury. Now you know, he did not, nothing good came up out of that. So out of the 2 times he was tried, they both ended in hung juries. And for another 31 years, that's how that case would go. But his wife, Myrtle, who moved his family to California, never stopped pressing authorities to look into the case, to keep fighting for justice. And what would happen is in 1989, the Jackson Clarendon Ledger published its investigation on the Della Beckwith trial during the 60s, and it found that the now defunct Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, a state agency supported by taxpayer dollars and supposedly would protect the image of the state, assisted Della Beckwith's attorneys in the second trial. The commission used state's resources to investigate members of the jury pool and lay a defense and aid in the defense of picking a sympathetic jury. Now, I want to add, because I didn't mention this before, but his juries were, of course, all white, but they were all white because black people were disenfranchised from voter registration practices, and they got the jury pools from voter registrators, from registered voters. So the very thing that Medgar Evers was fighting for is exactly what kept them from picking a mixed jury. Anyway, this expose into the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission was enough to launch a new trial for Mr. Della Beckwith. In 1990, he was indicted again at 71 years old, and was found guilty of first-degree murder found guilty in 1994 of first-degree murder, 31 years after Medgar Evers' death, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Della Beckwith would appeal against the guilty verdict, claiming that the 31-year lapse between the murder and the conviction denied him a fair trial. However, the Mississippi Supreme Court upheld the conviction in 1990, and in 2001, Della Beckwith would die in prison at 80 years old. What I would like to add to this is that when you look back, especially late civil rights, 50s and 60s, right into the civil rights movement, what you would see is that there was a shift from white men not being held accountable at all to white men being arrested and tried and then not being held accountable for those murders. You see that here with Medgar Evers, but this happened with the 16th Street Baptist Church, with Vernon Dahmer, with Emmett Till. Emmett Till, they ultimately were acquitted, But a lot of times, what would happen is I think in 16th Street they were acquitted. They were convicted on lesser charges, and none of them served more than a year in prison. It wouldn't be till 30 years later, to the mid 80s, that they would go back and look into these cases and try many of these people again. And a lot of times, those guys, a lot of times they were dead. But sometimes they were justice. Sometimes they got justice, but a lot of times they would go back in these cases, and the people that were critical to these cases no longer, some of them weren't living anymore. I think Samuel Bowers, who was convicted of killing Vernon Dahmer, had a famous quote where he said that there is not a jury in Mississippi that would convict a white man in the murder of a nigga in Mississippi. Like, just not going to happen. And while he was a horrible person, and that quote, time and time again, proves to be exceptionally correct. So yes, this was the life of Vernon Dahmer, and not Vernon Dahmer, and Medgar Evers. And I love telling this story, not because it saddens me, but it shows the price that the people during that time were willing to pay. And many times we will say, hey, it's not 1965, or I'm not my ancestors, but not realizing that our ancestors were willing to die for what they were doing. They, and some of them did. Many of them did. Were willing to put their life on the line, constantly. Even if you didn't put your life on the line, or you didn't get murdered, a lot of them were beaten. Like, for example, the Freedom Riders and John Lewis, they rode from New York to Jackson, Mississippi, and they knew they were going to get beaten. Martin Luther King told them when they hit Alabama that they wouldn't. When they hit Atlanta, he spoke to them. He's like, "You're not gonna make it through Alabama," and they didn't. They got to Alabama, and they beat them and set their bus on fire. And this is what this was like. This is what you were prepared to do for justice and inequality. Anyway, moving on. Where was I? My notes. So, one of the other interesting things that happened in the past week over in Black history is that Thurgood Marshall, the anniversary of Thurgood Marshall being named to the Supreme Court, that happened on June 13th. Up until that point, prior to that, he was the Solicitor General, which is the position that argues cases on behalf of the federal government before the Supreme Court. It is the opposing lawyer when you come and argue before the Supreme Court. They argue on behalf of the state. Thurgood Marshall found that position to be boring, and I could see how he could come to that conclusion coming from the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund, where they were handling civil rights cases up until that point, up until Brown versus the Board of Education. Then they got neutered by many southern states. They were banned in many places. So he left. But the interesting thing about Thurgood Marshall is this entire time, even when he was elected Solicitor General, even when he was put on nominated for the Supreme Court, they pushed back at him and went through his background like with a fine-tooth comb. But he had a bit of a feather in his cap. At that time, Thurgood Marshall was, to call him an informant for the FBI it's probably a bit of an overstatement, but he did provide them with information. When he was with the NAACP, he provided the FBI with information to try to keep the heat off of the NAACP. He felt as though if I turned in, at the time they were looking for communists. They were always looking for suspected communists. If I put the heat on people who I suspected to be communists or people that were fringe, then that would keep the heat off us. But what that did was add a bit of a feather in his cap with the FBI, specifically J. Edgar Hoover. And when J. Edgar Hoover co-signed on him on his nomination, because J. Edgar Hoover had acquired, as the executive director of the FBI at the time, he had acquired quite a bit of power, where he was kind of de facto president. Like, he lived through multiple different administrations, and there had been times they tried to neuter him, and they couldn't because he held dirt on everybody. So when he co-signed him, like, he was good. There's nothing that they could do. There's nothing anyone could do to him at that point. Once J. Edgar Hoover said that he was good. All right. Let's see what we got here. I mean, I got some couple other interesting things. I think I might land this plan in a second and talk to you guys. But I guess we'll talk about Angela Davis. I'm not gonna go over everything that happened. It's like, I just hit the high notes. But on June 4th, which wasn't this past week, but it was about 2 weeks ago. June 4th, Angela Davis was found not guilty for kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy charges. Okay, so the funny thing about Angela Davis is that before she became famous, she was a big activist, specifically fighting for the rights of prison inmates. And during that time, one of the causes she championed was the Soledad brothers, which were three men that were accused of killing a guard in Soledad prison. In 1970, Jonathan Jackson held up a courtroom demanding the freedom of the Soledad brothers. His brother being one of the Soledad brothers. The standoff ended with Jackson, two inmates, and one of the judges being killed. The FBI found that the guns were registered to Angela Davis in this failed hostage rescue. They assumed that Davis planned it, and within days, she was placed on the FBI's most wanted list. I think at the time, she was only the third woman ever to be placed on the FBI's most wanted list. She would then go on the run, and we'd be found in a hojo in New York. I want to say it was in New York. Was found in a hojo. President Nixon would call her the most dangerous terrorist, Angela Davis. And for the next 18 months, she spent time behind bars, going through the trial process. During that time, a bunch of committees formed, over 200 committees formed in the United States and another 67 abroad. They were singing songs about her, and she became a bit of a rallying cry. John Lennon and Yoko Ono even created a song called Angela. June 4th, 1972, Angela Davis was found not guilty because the court stated that simply having the guns registered to you was not enough does not prove conspiracy. Does not prove that she planned it. Does not prove that she was even involved. It just meant that she bought some guns, and they had those guns. One of the things that's interesting to me, Scott asked, I wanted to ask people, other historians, what they thought about this and whether they thought that she did it. And one of the things that stuck with me was her answer is that she didn't care. She did not care. And you know what? I get that. That makes complete sense. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not she did this, because at that time, what Black people had been through, it kind of felt like a little bit like getting your lick back. And in my mind, that makes complete sense. That makes complete sense. I would look back and think maybe she did it. I don't know. It's possible, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It never really mattered. Anywho, we're gonna transition. I'm gonna spend some time talking to you guys. If you have any questions for me, we'll kind of answer them and kind of shoot the shit a little bit. Once again, in the corner, this is my Substack. If you'd like to join me on my Substack. I write articles there a couple times about every week or so. I write new articles. No, thank you, man. I appreciate you for coming, checking me out, for listening. I'm trying to get my 10,000 hours in and get better at being in front of the camera, because this is tough for me. I'm a little nervous, but on the flip side of that, I kind of want to get to know you guys and let you guys see me and talk to me, and free exchange of dialogue. Even though it's not a whole lot of people saying anything in here, I'll give it a couple minutes. Nobody says anything. We'll kind of land this plane, or I'll find something else to talk about. That is one of the things that I do well. It's talking people heads off about history. So I checked the comments. It wasn't a whole lot of things in there. So we could talk about James Meredith and his march against fear. So if you're not familiar with James Meredith, he was he made history in 1962 by attempting to integrate the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss, and he faced riots and death threats and had to have federal protection to attend the University of Mississippi. But in June 6th of 1966, he started a 220-mile march from Memphis to Jackson. During that time, on the first day, he was shot. They I don't want to say it was flesh wound, but it didn't kill him. I think he got shot. My understanding is he was shot in the leg. He was rushed to the hospital, and civil rights leaders, including Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King, would pick up the march in his name. It was at this march that Stokely Carmichael, who was then the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, would first champion the calls for Black Power, which would eventually become a rallying cry for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and kind of lead into the Black Power movement with the Panthers, and all of this is on the heels of the death of Malcolm X. Meredith recovered from his wounds and then rejoined the march on June 26th as they reached Jackson, Mississippi. Later on in his life, and while James Meredith is viewed as a civil rights icon, he kind of reject that idea. He didn't like the idea of being a civil rights icon in the mainstream movement, and basically just told him that he was on a mission from God. When I looked into this, though, I found out that he supported some kind of controversial people like David Duke. So I don't know. I'm not sure what time you're on. I'm not sure what time he's on, and that kind of gave me pause to the kind of person that he was. But the story was super interesting, and I like at least in those two moments in history, with the March Against Freedom and him integrating the University of Mississippi. He had his moment, and then later in life, like whatever he did with that moment afterwards, that was kind of on him. That was kind of on him. All right. I guess we're just going to land this plane. Oh man. I thank you guys for coming, man. I really enjoy doing these stories. It's a little nervous because when I do these the videos, I can edit and stop and come back and I messed that up. I don't like the way that sounded. Oh, let me get my pitch right. And here, when I'm telling these stories, it's so live, you don't get a chance to mess up. I just gotta have to good work through it. It's scary. I don't like it. I don't like it, but I do like the instantaneous. Not a whole lot about Garvey. I had been debating on whether or not I was going to do a story on Garvey. And one of the interesting things about, at least for me, about Garvey is that he had a famous beef with Du Bois. I feel like Du Bois did beef with everybody, but Du Bois was an asshole and a colorist. And while that didn't come out in his beef with Booker T. Washington, it really came out in his beef with Garvey. And he would kind of call him some ugly names. I want to say he called him like dark skinned gorilla or something mean, something mean. And yet, when Garvey was arrested, he fought in support of Garvey and trying to get Garvey released from prison. Thank you, man. I'm glad you like this. I promise that I'm gonna try to make this try to make these things a bit more regular. It's I want to do this like on the weeks that I don't do a video, even though I do have a video coming out this week. I guess I should probably talk about it in a second. But I kind of want to do this on the weeks that I don't have a video coming out, because I want to kind of, get out here and talk to you guys and get used to seeing me and talk and doing these things live. I could tell some of the same stories that we've done live, and they kind of truncated. But also I get to say things that I wouldn't be able to say on a faceless channel with a script, because you're kind of censored. You feel a bit censored, And also they use some of my videos for schools. Like I can't curse. But yeah, I have a video coming out tomorrow on the occupation of our neighborhoods by the National Guard. This was sparked by Agent Orange and him sending the National Guard into California. And I looked into how many times in the past that the National Guard had been federalized, and a lot of times that was during the civil rights movement or riots against injustice, like in LA riots in '92, or the Little Rock 9, or Bloody Sunday. These are the other times when they had to have the National Guard federalized and against governors' wishes, or sometimes they were federalized and governors asked for it. Like in LA, he asked for support, but in Selma and with Little Rock 9, like nah. Like, matter of fact, the Little Rock 9 was particularly spicy because I think Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954. Afterwards, 1957, they decided that they were going to use some of the high schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, as a test for integration. And this led to the 9 Black students enrolling in the previously all-white Central High School. Coming up until that point, like Daisy Bates was getting them ready, and they had all talked and had conversations the day before. Governor Orville Flavis, which is a name, told them, basically said that he was sending in the National Guard for their protection, to protect law and order, to keep people from getting injured or getting hurt. He didn't really explain what that meant, but they knew that he was against integration. And kind of the writing was on the wall just a little bit. So the next day, they call, or I think it was a couple days later, they all were supposed to show up to school together. They were going to be walked into school by some local ministers. What was her name? One of the young ladies, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but one of the young ladies did not have a phone and did not get that message. She was unaware that they were all walking into school together. So she showed up on the other side of the school and had to stoically walk into the school by herself, with a crowd of people surrounding her. And this is where you see that iconic photo of her stoically walking in with her glasses on and people screaming in the background. She's quoted as stating that she was walking through the crowd and she was looking for a familiar face. And she saw this old lady, and she was like, "Oh man, she looks nice." And that lady spit in her face. Like, this is what we're dealing with. Only to find out that once they got up to the steps, that they couldn't get into the school. They weren't allowed into the school for their protection. They waited a couple days. The state and federal, the feds had no negotiations. They were not budging. So President Eisenhower would federalize the National Guard. So the National Guard, from 1 week to the next, went from keeping the kids from entering the school to protecting those same kids and from the crowd and allowing them into Central High School. This went on. The protection went on for the rest of the year. It didn't stop them from having issues. They still, like, of course, this protection wasn't everywhere. The students were still on their neck on a regular basis. I think one of the Citrus Park 9 ended up getting expelled from the school because she dumped like hot soup on one of the white boys that was accosting her. Like, this is the sort of thing that they had to deal with. They were dealing with on a regular basis. Anyway, that flexing of federal authority was showed people, other states that, hey, I will send in troops if I need to uphold integration, and you didn't see this anymore, even though Little Rock closed down schools for a whole year after that, but that's a different story. um, so yeah, I think this is a good. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to do. I never know how these stories are going to do. I just kind of get ideas and I put them out, and sometimes they do well, and sometimes they don't. I thought it was interesting. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? Um, Kind of feeding off that, like going into the Selma, which was just a decade later. I think I was in 1965. Going similar things happened. We were marching for against voter rights in Alabama, marching from Selma to Montgomery, and they had not even made it out of Selma. That was the Edmund Peters Bridge is in Selma. And state trooper showed up and was like, "Nah, bro, you're not going nowhere. Chill out, chill out." And at the front, and I talked about John Lewis a minute ago and how he was with the Freedom Riders and he got his head cracked riding with the Freedom Riders. Like, once again, because John Lewis was about that life. He was at the front of this group. They have a very iconic photo where you see them being accosted by the state troopers, and they're telling them that you need to turn around, and they're just standing there with John Lewis in his trench coat right in the front. And then, like 2 seconds later, there's another picture of John Lewis like on the ground with a billy club getting cracked in the head. Like, this is the kind of person that John Lewis was. So right after that, after this happened, the civil rights organizations wanted protections that they weren't gonna that this sort of thing wasn't going to happen again. And Governor George Wallace, Mr. Segregation Forever, was like, no way. He was like, nah, I can't guarantee any of those things. So once again, Lyndon B. Johnson had to federalize the National Guard and sent them in to protect the people. And 50,000 marchers marched from Selma to Montgomery with an escort of the National Guard against the wishes of George Wallace, who was another he was a piece of shit. Another piece of shit, But anyway, I'm gonna get you guys out of here. I know you're like, man, if you don't stop rambling. Before I go, one quick story about George Wallace. And to bring this story all the way around before I land and get you guys out of here. George Wallace ran for president as a Dixiecrat, as a Democrat, Dixiecrat at the time, in 1968, 1972. 1972 was the same year as Shirley Chisholm, when she was running for president as Democrats. While on the campaign trail, George Wallace was shot in an assassination attempt, left paralyzed, sitting in a hospital room. While he's in that room, Shirley Chisholm, who is a wonderful woman, one of my heroes, I love her to death. Some of my greatest quotes come from Shirley Chisholm. She's an awesome hero. She came in and said and visited him and talked to him and took some heat because people were like, "Why are you coming to visit this dude? He's trash." He's like, "Because I would want him to do the same to me." You show the empathy that you want to see in the world. You be the empathy that you want the world to see. So he went and visited him. And while there are no recordings of what happened during that conversation, and we can only speculate on what they talked about, in the years after that conversation, because he would continue to do political positions, run in politics and things like that, he would talk about that he regretted his position on segregation and race, and that he felt bad and asked for an apology. He would call some of the civil rights leaders and ask for an apology because he felt like he had been on the wrong side of history. And I love this story because, one, it shows that people can change, and two, it just shows how much of a power's power, just having a little bit of empathy, how it can have on people. But also, three, and you see this a lot in the current day, a lot of people don't really see change till it happens to them. So things are right at your doorstep. You realize the error of your ways or how much you done or said, and you're like, I shouldn't have. I was wrong. And that a lot of times that doesn't become very apparent until it's too late. It's too late. So yeah, fuck them. Let me stop. Let me stop. But George Wallace wasn't a good dude. You don't get a chance to change your ways in the fourth quarter, man. You should have did that years ago. How much damage you done? You know, I'm supposed to be happy because you're sorry. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for coming out, for listening to me rant for 46 minutes. You guys are troopers. I love every single one of you. I got my socials down there. They so small I can't read them with my old eyes. But if you do this barcode up here, this is my Substack. I'm very proud of it. I think that I think I'm a writer. I'm a writer sometimes. I do all right. Also, I have a video coming out tomorrow. I kind of talked about a little bit about the National Guard, about the National Guard and their occupation of our neighborhoods. Once again, I think it's dope. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so on my Substack, socials. I love to talk to any of you guys. I know I don't answer comments all that much on YouTube. I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to be a better Mike, a better me. But yeah, I love you guys. Thank y'all for coming out. Peace. It's still up. It's still up. It's cool.